Hi everybody, and welcome back to Sociology 271, Introduction to the Family. You're going to hear the occasional bit of meowing here because my cat has realized that I'm talking, and so she figures she needs to get in on the action too. I'm not going to read out reminders for which student ID numbers are responsible for uploading questions to the eClass folder this time around, because I'm assuming at this point in the semester you've got a pretty good idea of when it's your week and you will act accordingly. So this week we're going to talk about intimate partnerships, forms of couple relationships. We're not going to take as much of a historical approach as we have in previous weeks. We're going to be looking more over the last 10, 15 years and what trends we're seeing that we can extrapolate into the future. I should note here, by the way, that in order to upload this lecture, I had to divide it into two parts. So it's all blended together seamlessly into one video form, but there will be a break in the middle, and then you'll have the title slide again, and then you'll have the second part appearing. So just make sure you watch everything through to the end. So back to where I was. Couple relationships, partnerships, and what that looks like in Canada. We're going to start with the question of marriage, not because I think marriage is the only or the best or the ultimate expression of adult partnerships, but simply because it's been the dominant one for a long time, and it's the one that seems to generate a lot of controversy, debate, anxiety amongst people in general, particularly around the question of whether marriage is a decaying institution or whether marriage is dead or declining or what have you. So we'll look at some of the evidence on both sides of that question. We'll look at some of the patterns and trends in the way marriage has been changing in Canada. And then we're going to look beyond the institution of formal marriage. The authors of your textbook in that chapter, they talk about a lot of different ways that adult couples get together and stay together and the forms that their partnerships take. Rather than try to cover absolutely everything, I'm going to zoom in the second part of this lecture on two of the biggest trends in adult partnership formation in Canada over the last 20 odd years. And those are the trend towards cohabitation, of two adults deciding to set up a home and live together without being married, which would have been scandalous, a generation ago, and same-sex partnerships, both in the form of same-sex marriage and also same-sex cohabitation and domestic partnerships, which represent numerically a very small number of all partnerships in Canada, but in terms of the increase or the rate of growth in people identifying themselves as being in same-sex co-residing partnerships, it's really taking off. It's a huge increase, which is kind of fascinating. So that's my intro for now, the usual stuff. This lecture is the property of me, Amy Kaler. Please do not duplicate, copy, revise, circulate, etc. without my written consent. And away we go. So, hi everybody, welcome to this week. We'll be talking about the types of intimate couples that people form in adulthood, at various points in their lives that are usually related to the development and the elaboration of their family ties and family arrangements. We'll be focusing initially on marriage, not because I think marriage is the ideal or the norm or the way it should be, but simply because marriage as a form of coupleship has so much kind of symbolic and cultural and ideological weight on it that it's good to know a little bit more about it, what it looks like in Canada today, and to think a little bit about what it means and the different meanings that marriage has had over time for various people. Move on and look at marriage kind of in the context of a whole array of different ways in which people are organizing their intimate couple lives, their partnership lives in Canada today. So here's where we're going to go today. I'm going to start by talking about the meanings of marriage, some historical and contemporary meanings, and you may find that some of the ideas here remind you of ideas that we've heard in previous lectures about ideals and shifting ideals of adult relationships. I want to get to the question, is marriage dead? Not because I myself personally think marriage is dead, but because this is one of these perennial kind of social policy, like what's wrong with the world, what's going on around us, questions that come up constantly, sort of year after year and decade after decade, that marriage is an institution which is declining, marriage is an institution which is decaying in Canada, and we'll look a bit at some of the evidence around this. The very fact that the question gets asked so often, what's the state of marriage as an institution, is a clue to how important marriage continues to be, not just as the sort of arrangement that people enter into for their adult lives, but also as a kind of, touchstone or ideal for how we think about adult relationships. I want to then move on to patterns of coupling and adult relationship partnership forming today. I'm going to be relying pretty heavily on census data, especially from the last 3 waves in 2006, 2011, and 2016. So you're going to see quite a few charts and graphs and whatnot coming your way to give kind of an overall picture of patterns and trends there. And then I'm going to focus on 2 trends that have become really strong over the last couple of decades. Your textbook goes into detail about other emerging trends and forms in adult couple relationships, like living apart together and polyamory. We unfortunately don't have time to go into depth about all of those, so I've picked out 2 of the most significant, which are the growth in cohabitation, adults living together in a committed relationship but not married, and same-sex partnerships, both married and not married partnering. So we're going to look at those 2 major trends in a bit more focus and a bit more depth. Let's start by looking at some of the meanings that have been ascribed to marriage, and by this I mean quote-unquote traditional or heterosexual, heteronormative marriage in the couple of centuries leading up to where we find ourselves now. For many social scientists, and particularly for social and cultural anthropologists, marriage has been understood as a status, and in particular a sort of elevated status or a respective status relative to the state of being unmarried. And we see this in societies, all over the world, that people who are married tend to accrue a certain prestige in the eyes of others, a certain respect. It's taken as an indication of certain positive things about them. So marriage has often been understood as one of several rites of passage that people go through in their lives. Usually a rite of passage moves you from a, in quotes, lower state to a higher state. And if you look at all the rituals that have developed around marriage, this proliferation of rituals is one of the key things that tells us, okay, there's an important rite of passage from one status to another going on here. So we have things like the engagements and the whole notion of the engagement ring and the engagement party, the wedding shower, which initially signified the creation of a new household that was going to require all of these household goods, and now, not quite so much, but the form of the wedding shower remains. Stag parties in the last kind of, it's like a semi-formal saying goodbye to the old status of being a single person who could just hang out with their other single friends and do single stuff all day. In different parts of the world, there are other rituals that mark the transition from one status to another. The Charivari in Europe, and you can look that up if you want to know what that's about. The Mchindi practice in parts of India. In Zimbabwe, where I lived for a few years, there was the ritual of what was called the Mombe Yomai, which literally means the cow of the mother, which was the sort of ritual presentation of a cow to the mother of the bride to be her cow, the mother of the bride's cow, that would be kept separate from her husband's herd. And some scholars interpret that as a kind of symbolic substitution. The daughter is going away from the family, and the cow, I mean, obviously a cow and a person are not the same thing, but the cow kind of marks the departure of the daughter and her symbolic replacement by this symbol of fertility and wealth, etc., etc. You could take a deep dive into marriage rituals around the world, and find many examples of ways to say goodbye to the old status of being, dependent on your parents, or being single, or being in some ways younger, and hello to the new status of being a married person. Some historians have pointed to what they see as a major change in the way marriage was conceptualized, beginning, if we're looking at the European, North American context, kind of late 18th century. And that's the idea of a transition from, as the phrase goes, from yoke mates to soulmates. Now, yoke mates refers to the idea that the husband and wife are kind of yoked together like a team of oxen. They're pulling their plow or whatever it is. They're both kind of facing out in the same direction, and they've got a task at hand, which is to build the household, build the family, keep things moving, and so forth. And this sort of yoke mates approach to marriage often emerges in contexts where marriage is a practical collaboration between kin groups. There's one kin group or extended family here, and there's another one here, and by uniting in the form of a marriage between their young people, they are able to prosper and to move forward and to work together. This notion of kind of marriage as the joining of yoke mates calls on a lot of sort of emotional and symbolic resources related to the idea of duty and responsibility. Married people have duties to each other as well as to their families. They're taking on the responsibilities of an adult. They're moving into an adult within the sort of network of other adults that they find themselves in. And they're pulling their plow together, and ideally, not always in practice, of course, they're moving in the same direction. Now, the soulmates sort of twist on marriage has its roots way back in the notions of romantic love and, the only person in the world for you and so forth, but really comes to emerge as a foundation for marriage not all that long ago, just a couple of hundred years ago. And this is the idea that marriage, similar to the pure relationship or the confluent love ideal, is a commitment, a personal commitment between two individuals where the dominant emotion is love and attraction and affection for each other. If you want to hear more about this, historian Stephanie Coontz, in the link below, if you click on it, explains in her words how love conquered marriage starting in the 18th century, and how North American and European societies got from a situation where marriage is a matter of being sort of yoked together, to a situation where marriage is ideally understood to be the two soulmates not necessarily looking forward together as though they're like oxen in a yoke, but looking towards each other and at each other and partaking in that individual relationship. Another way to look at the changes in marriage and how people think about marriage is to compare changing expectations of marriage from an older style, the yoke-mate style, which is also the complementary idea of adult relationships that we were introduced to in previous lectures, and the newer or the more companionate style, which we were introduced to in previous lectures, where the partners in the relationship are companions, doing things together, supporting each other, um, rather than sort of complementing each other's, or in addition to, I guess we should say, complementing each other's strengths. So, I mean, I'm making some huge generalizations here, and there's bound to be exceptions to any of them, but in general, in societies that are characterized by a complementary approach to marriage, where it's kind of a practical collaboration between people who are connected to a larger kin group, marriage tends to be almost universal. You really can't be an adult unless you are a married adult. There's just, or if you are single for an extended period of time as an adult, it means something's gone wrong. That's because marriage is bound up with adulthood. Being married confers adult status. That's why there's so many rites of passage around it, and the movement from being a young person to an adult member of your community. In these societies, marriage is not just sort of a nice thing to aspire to, but is actually needed for economic survival. Individual adults on their own tend not to be viable economic units. They're not able to produce everything they need for themselves and to engage in whatever the economic activity of that society is. So marriage makes you economically able to, continue to exist. In terms of reproduction, then, under the complementary view of marriage, parenthood is really indivisible rather, from marriage. So a married couple become a mother and a father, ideally as soon as possible. Might take a little while, who knows? But a married couple that does not become a parenting couple, again, this is viewed as exceptional and kind of a sad thing, and possibly even immoral or dangerous, depending on the society. Gender norms, as you might expect, tend to be distinct and tend to be complementary. Men are responsible for ABC, women are responsible for XYZ. Often this breaks down around a sort of providing for the family outside the home and taking care of the family within the home kind of breakdown. But the idea that men and women are best friends and do all those things together is not really part of it. Marriages under this way of looking at marriage, ideally they're lifelong, and it really is till death do you part. And part of that is because marriage is sort of a precondition for adulthood, and because marriage is economically necessary for survival. So people go into marriage with the expectation or the hope that this will be a lifelong thing. Is this realistic? Can people actually live happily this way? It's an open question. It depends on who you are. I'm talking about ideals here. I'm not talking about whether a particular form of marriage is better than another form of marriage. Under the newer or companionate marriages, approach to marriage, marriage is often understood as a contingent ideal, by which I mean that it's not necessarily universal. Some people marry, some people don't. People may move in and out of marriages. It's not an essential sort of precondition for being a functioning adult. Under this way of looking at marriage, marriage is maybe one aspect of adulthood, but there are other aspects.
setting up your own household, establishing a career, many other things are involved in the transition to adulthood. Marriage is not a defining moment. Marriage is also not essential for economic survival. There may definitely be economic benefits to marriage. Two people may be able to do better economically than one, but it's not a matter of if you don't marry, then you have no, you can't look after yourself or support yourself. In the companionate version of marriage, where marriage is really primarily about the connection between two people, parenthood might be deferred, or it might be postponed. Having kids right away and setting up this family household is not an essential, a foundational part of this newer companionate approach to marriage, and it is possible to be married and not parenting, married where the main relationship is between the two spouses. Gender norms in this way of looking at things don't disappear altogether in practice, as we shall see later on, but they tend to be less distinct. There's more overlap. There are fewer things that are understood to be that's women's business and that's men's business. These companionate marriages, similar to the confluent love ideal or the pure relationship, aren't necessarily till death do us part affairs. There may be multiple endings. People may end up divorcing, they may end up separating and living apart. One person may die, they both may die. The notion that the only acceptable ending to a marriage is death is not as common in societies where the companionate ideal of marriage is predominant. Whatever meanings we assign to marriage, and regardless of the way people think about it, there's one interesting phenomenon that seems to hold true, and that is that marriage has different gendered meanings for men and for women. There's a pile of sociological literature out there that suggests that if you take men and women who are married and compare them to their single counterparts, and you match in terms of age and region and income and all of that other stuff, marriage appears to benefit both men and women, but it benefits men a lot more. So, like I said, huge body of research. I'll just try to sum it up really quickly. Interesting phenomenon about the way we've organized heterosexual marriage today. If you look at married men and compare them to single men, you find that married men live longer. Married men self-report better health, better physical and mental health, and this operates irrespective of whether they say they're happy with their marriage or not so happy with it. Same thing with happiness and life satisfaction. Married men, compared to single men, report higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction, even if they describe their marriage as being unsatisfying or not working well or what have you. Economically, married men also are able to amass more wealth than their peers who are not married, and they typically have more financial resources, which isn't really surprising when you consider that in most marriages, you've got two adults coming together and often they're both bringing financial resources. So for men, marriage is a pretty good deal. It's not quite as good a deal for women when you look at the research there. Compared to single women, women who are married have more economic resources. They have more wealth. They're able to build more wealth. Stuff, not surprising. And married women report higher levels of self-reported happiness than single women, but only, and this is the kicker, only if they report that their marriage quality is also high. In other words, the perceived quality of the marriage influences in a way that it doesn't appear to influence men's. Men derive a benefit from being married under whatever conditions. Women derive a benefit from being married if they also report satisfaction with their marriage and the marriage quality is high. And the health differentials between married and single women are really not very pronounced. They're nothing like the health differentials between married and single men. And this finding has been so persistent for the last 40 odd years. Jessie Bernard, who was a pioneering feminist sociologist, kind of summed it up in a statement which some of you may find a bit surprising. She argued that in every marital union, and in her day, marital unions all were heterosexual, same-sex marriage wasn't legal. There are two marriages in every marital union. There's his and hers, and his marriage is better. And I'd be very interested in hearing from you your thoughts or your ideas as to why this might be so. Let's inquire into the survival prospects of marriage in Canada today. This question, is marriage dead? Is marriage a decaying or deteriorating institution? Gets brought up over and over again in popular press and in the media, and people kind of bemoaning the state of the world today. So let's take a look at what's going on with marriage. Who's getting married? What are people thinking about it? And see if we can come up with an answer that's more nuanced than just, yes, marriage is dead, or no, marriage is alive and thriving as ever. If we take a look at the numbers, it definitely looks like marriage as an institution may be in decline in Canada. And what we have here from census data is the percentage of Canadians aged 18 to 34, so the kind of young to slightly middle adult age group, who have ever been married by census year. And you'll note back in 1971, we're just kind of coming off the baby boomer thing then at that point. More than half of everybody between 18 and 34 either was married at that time or in some cases had been married and then, unmarried again in some way. Until it starts falling off in the 80s, down in the 90s, bounces around a little bit, and in 2016 we find that from over half of all young Canadians have been married to only a fifth have been married. So the married individuals in the 18 to 34 group are actually a significant minority of everybody in that group. Lots of stuff going on here. There's post-secondary education. As post-secondary education spreads, people delay their marriages and get married later, maybe even when they're older than 34. Establishment of careers and professions and occupations for both men and women plays a role. We're seeing more and more indications that living with one's parents, the cliche about the millennial kid living in the basement, is actually not just a weird meme, but is actually a thing that is leading to a postponement of marriage. All of these things are pushing marriage in some cases later in life, and in other cases it's just not. So if we look at numbers of people that are married, especially among younger people, the world has changed a lot since the 70s. But if we look at how people think of marriage, attitudes towards marriage or ideas about marriage, we get a slightly different picture. And these numbers here are from an Angus Reid poll that was done just last year in 2018. And what the poll takers did was they interviewed adults in different age groups and asked how many agreed or strongly agreed, or rather, so it's very important or somewhat important for couples who want to spend their lives together to actually formally get married. In other words, whether they saw spending your life together and getting married as two things that should go together. And this is pretty fascinating because if you look at this chart here, it's the youngest adults and the oldest adults who seem to have a pretty strong attachment to the idea that marriage is what you should do if you find someone you want to spend your life with. In fact, the same numbers for both of them. Over half of the youngest adults, 18 to 24, and over half of the oldest adults, who are 65 and older, agree very much or somewhat with that statement. And it's the ones in the middle who are a little more non-committal, or maybe they're just kind of cynical about marriage, having seen a lot of divorces, who knows? They're the ones who are less likely to say that marriage is really important for couples that have found each other and want to stay together. So sort of fascinating there, the idealistic young people, and we may think that the older people are a little more conservative. We can speculate about what's going on here, but we don't know for sure. But it is a really interesting result from this Angus Reid poll. Let's break it down a bit more. Same data, same poll, but broken down along social categories in addition to age, to see what influences ideas about marriage. And in this research, again, really interesting from a sociological point of view, two of the things that seemed to be most strongest in sort of separating people out into those who were sort of firmly pro-marriage or believed it was really important, and those who didn't share those views, were politics and visible minority status. So of all the questions are slightly different here compared to the last slide, and this was just so they could bring this into conformity with the way survey questions are asked in the States. But the general attribute being measured, the sort of orientation towards marriage, is pretty consistent. Political views, people who identify in terms of political party with the Conservative Party are a lot more likely to say that marriage and having children is really important, and society is better off if lots of people are married with children. People who identified themselves as voting Liberal or voting NDP, not much difference between those two parties, but a lot of difference between Liberal and NDP supporters and Conservative supporters in terms of the extent to which people agreed that society is better off if people get married and have kids. So there's some big differentiation there. Interestingly, people who identify as a visible minority, Black, Indigenous, person of color, in this survey were also more likely than people who did not identify as a visible minority to say that for child rearing, marriage is better. More than half of people who visible minority said that marriage is, or if people are having children together, they ought to marry. Marriage is better, compared to less than half of people who did not identify themselves as a member of a visible minority. So that's an interesting result as well. It looks like racialization or racial category has an influence on the way that people view marriage. And probably to nobody's surprise, gender of same Angus Reid survey also seems to have an influence on how people view marriage. And it interacts with age in an interesting way. So this was the question here, and it's a bit awkward that questions get phrased different ways at different points in the survey. The question here is, marriage is simply not necessary, and what chunk of people agree marriage is simply not necessary? In other words, if you don't get married, absolutely fine. And we find, interestingly, that men in the younger age group are much more likely than women to say marriage is not necessary. Or to flip it around, to express it another way, women in the youngest age group are likely to disagree with that statement. In other words, to believe that, or to articulate that they believe marriage is necessary. Then we move to slightly older groups, and we see that gender gap um, almost disappears, which again, very intriguing. What's going on with the youngest adults these days? I have speculated a little bit about what's going on there. Perhaps women are more attached to marriage than men because marriage has historically functioned as kind of a master status for women. By which I mean that being married for women has often been a stronger identity marker than for men. The experience of one's parents' generations, the influence of feminism, especially for women who are a bit older and have um, perhaps more experience in the adult world, which is still kind of gender, still a gender hierarchy going on there, may have led adult women to think, yeah, marriage doesn't work out all that well, or not adult women, older adult women, to think, yeah, marriage isn't actually working out all that well for women. Um, Again, I'd be curious in hearing from any of you what you think is going on with this age and gender pattern related to how important marriage is. So, the last couple of slides suggest that young people are actually quite positive about marriage and have associated with good things, and they answer questions on surveys that indicate that they put a priority on marriage as good for them and good for the community and so forth. Um, Yet their behavior in terms of marriage um, is a little bit different. We saw that a few slides ago when we looked at the proportion of young adults who are ever have been married, and we saw how that's dropped off drastically in the last few decades. And here's a slightly more fine-grained look at a similar phenomenon, which is the average age at first marriage, broken down by men and women. And what you see, I'm sure you can probably predict this by now, we see that average age at first marriage drops right after the war. These are the baby boom years, down to a low of only 22 years for women, which means that there were a whole lot of women getting married when they were 18, 19, 20, 21. And then it picks up and it goes up and up and up until now. The most recent data I could find was from 2008, but I don't have any reason to think that the last 10 or 12 years would have been different. Now it's about 30 for both of them. And these are, on one hand, that's like what, an 8-year difference? Is that how many years is 8 years? On the other hand, these are 8 really important years when people are completing post-secondary education, consolidating plans for adult life, figuring things out, getting started in an occupation or a career. These are really important 8 years, and it makes a big difference whether you're married or not as you're going through them. You'll note something that sometimes surprises many people, that ages at marriage were also reasonably high right before they fell off with the Second World War and then the baby boom. And what you have is a phenomenon where it wasn't so much post-secondary education, those opportunities that were pushing marriage ages or keeping marriage ages up. It was often the need on the part mainly of men to consolidate enough resources to set up their own households. In a largely rural or sort of small town Canada, this could often mean inheriting or acquiring land or getting the farm going, finding a job that would be secure enough that you could support a wife and kids on it, and so forth, kept marriage for ages at first marriage rather high. So it wasn't the case that everybody was getting married at 18, 19, 20 until they all started going to university. Marriage ages have been high for a while before that. You'll note that there's a gap between men and women, and that gap is closing. So at the height of the baby boom, men were about 3-ish years older than women on average when they got married, and that's shrunk down to about 2 years or so. So not a huge difference, but it does reflect that we have a lot more women spending their late teens, early 20s in post-secondary education now than we did, say, 1961. And what this means is that marriages, the age gap between marriage partners is shrinking. People are coming closer and closer together in age. Patterns of marriage timing are sensitive to broader socioeconomic trends, cultural trends, both among young people, young adults getting married for the first time, and we need to remember that there are also lots of older adults outside that 18 to 34 age group who may either just not get married or who may marry, the marriage comes to an end, and then they choose to remarry or not to remarry, depending on a whole host of factors. So, here are some of the things that are influencing people's timing in marriage and the decisions about getting married. Young, as I mentioned earlier, there is some evidence that this whole thing about the millennial youth living in mom and dad's basement for extended periods is in fact a real thing, and that young adults are co-residing with their parents for more years of their life than they did a decade or two ago, which delays the establishment of their own household, and that's usually associated with marriage, often to save up enough money to put down a down payment on a place or to get established in some way or pay back student debt or what have you. There's often economic motivations as well as just wanting to continue living with parents. That brings us to the increasing, to two other economic factors. One is people reporting that they perceive financial hurdles in creating their own household, having kids. So this includes the cost of purchasing a home. Compared to a few decades ago, starter homes, in quotation marks, you can imagine me doing air quotes, um, are luxurious and consequently much more expensive than the kind of entry level, baseline, kind of basic, nothing fancy, but you own it house that people in previous generations, or apartment that people in previous generations would have bought. So the cost of kind of getting into a situation where you own your own home is perceived to be higher than in previous generations. And of course, we can't forget debt. There is student debt, which is higher than it's been before because school costs more. There's also increasing consumer debt among young people, which is credit card debt and lines of credit and things like that. We could go off on a long tangent about why this may be the case, that people in their 20s now have debt loads that in previous years would have been more common in people much older. But it nevertheless remains that while you're in a significant amount of debt, um, getting married, setting up your own household may not be a priority at the moment. For older adults, too, economic drivers are important for older adults who have been divorced or widowed and who may choose to remain single and not remarry. For women in particular, being financially independent is quite important in that older age group. And now, as the boomers and the Gen X age cohorts kind of go through their life cycle, we're seeing age cohorts of women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who have more financial resources and autonomy than their mothers or their grandmothers did at the same age. So the idea that you need to remarry because as a middle-aged single woman, you just can't make it on your own is no longer as strong as it once was. Similarly, again, this is a driver for women. Women in those age groups have concerns with protecting property that they may own. They may not wish to enter into sort of shared property arrangements. They may have pensions that they don't necessarily wish to share. And one of the ways to ensure that you keep your own property and pension, or that you're able to pass it on to your children as you rather than someone else, is to remain unmarried. So changing economic status of women is driving this. Um, there's been an increase, as I believe is noted in your text, in the living apart together type of arrangements, especially among middle-aged and older people, which may come as a surprise because we tend to think of the long-term relationship thing as something that younger people do when one is going to school here and one's got a job somewhere else. But in fact, the biggest increase in people who describe their primary relationship as living apart together has been among people in their 40s and 50s. Again, really interesting social phenomenon, and I'm sure lots of interesting research is going to come out as to why that is. So marriage is a big part of the picture, but it is far from being the only piece of the picture. So as not to leave the impression or give the impression that marriage is the way that it's supposed to be and everything else is just an alternative and so on, I want now to look at many different ways of being a couple, becoming a couple, in addition to heteronormative marriage, and to look at the diversity of patterns of couple formation in Canada. Marriage was at one point the dominant form of life for adult couples who were cohabiting or who were living in the same place at the same time. As you can see in these results from the Canadian census, in 1981, the vast majority of people who identified themselves as being part of a couple or co-residing with an adult significant other were in fact married. And then how many years later is that? I can't even see. I'm going to start this again. This chart shows you, kind of gets to the same point using slightly different information. This is the percentage increase by type of household among census families in the 5 years but 2011. So just to let me unpack that a bit. What we see here is that while all these types of households increased in numbers between 2006 and 2011, which is kind of what you'd expect because the Canadian population overall grew, the number of married couples actually only increased 3%, whereas the number of common law couples between 2006 and 2011 increased by 14%, and the number of households that were headed by a single parent increased by 8%. So what this means is that the proportion of households which are headed by either common law couples or single parents are growing much more rapidly than the proportion of households or the number of households that are headed by a married couple, even though the numeric majority of households in Canada remains married couple households. But the trend is not favoring married couple households. The trend is the real momentum is with other types of household. If we break this down a bit, we find that there are lots of drivers, trends within trends, I guess you could say, lots of things that are driving this move towards household structures which are not marriage in Canadian society. And your text goes into some detail about things. We've already talked about later marriage. People aren't getting married as young as they used to, so they're spending more of their adult lives in a non-married state. We're finding that people who've been married and the marriage ends are not remarrying quite as quickly, if at all, as used to be the case. We find that some couples are opting for, while they understand themselves as couples or in partnership, they're not co-residing, they're living apart together. And then we have two that I'm going to kind of zero in on mostly. One is the rise in cohabitation, which is also referred to as common law living, and the other is the growth in same-sex marriage and also other forms of same-sex partnership. So here we go with that. So first we're going to talk about cohabitation or living common law, or I'm just barely old enough to remember when people used to refer to this without any irony or anything at all as living in sin or living out of wedlock, which gives you the sense correctly that these used to be considered a sort of morally dubious and actually semi-outlaw option that like respectable people would not engage in. Times have changed. Let's take a look at cohabitation, common law, whatever you want to call it, and where that fits into the landscape of couples in Canada. The proportion of couples living common law has been growing pretty steadily since the late 60s, early 70s. As you see here, common law couples as a percentage of all census families has had more than doubled since 1976. So, as I said earlier, cohabiting or living common law has not overtaken marriage as the dominant form of adult partnership or adult couple, but it's no longer an outlier by any means. And we'll see a little bit more about the trend in the next few slides. So we've got more and more Canadians opting for living together or cohabiting rather than being married. And the question comes up, okay, so what difference does that make? Are cohabiting or common law unions or households, how different are they really from being married? And for a long time in sociology, one of the prevailing views about these sorts of unions is that they were kind of like a trial marriage or like a practice run for marriage. And it is indeed true that most couples who begin common law at the end of 5 years or 10 years, either they've separated or they've kind of moved in the direction of marriage in a more formalized union. Often this is precipitated by the birth of a child. But it's not the whole story to say, well, common law is kind of like a starter marriage or the first stage of a marriage. When we compare common law unions and marriages, a few things stand out that make them different. One is that cohabitation tends to be of shorter duration than marriages, even though people aren't necessarily getting married with the idea that they're going to be together until they die. Typically, the length of a marriage is longer than the length of a cohabiting relationship. In part, that's because cohabiting relationships sometimes turn into marriage. In part, that's because cohabiting relationships are often easier, legally speaking, which we'll get to in a moment, to exit. Some sociologists have argued that cohabiting relationships don't receive the same amount of sort of social support and resources and strengthening that marriages do. So it's easier for the two individuals to just kind of break apart. Cohabiting relationships are also characterized by greater gender egalitarianism. This is on the level of broad generalization, and there's going to be a whole lot of individual variation. But typically, income differentials between men and women in heterosexual cohabiting unions are smaller than income differentials between husbands and wives. Task flexibility, who undertakes what bit of unpaid housework at home, typically displays less specialization, less like men's work, women's work division in cohabiting couples than in married couples. And some sociologists and psychologists say that this is because married couples have a more, in quotes, traditional view of relations between the sexes or between the genders. And this more traditional view of families Um, it sort of encourages them towards getting married as distinct from living together, and also encourages them towards greater degree of gender specialization, differentiation within the home. Typically, cohabiting couples are less enmeshed with extended families. It gets to the point above about social support. When sociologists study things like how much does each person know about their partner's family or relatives or parents and so forth, they find married people tend to have a greater degree of knowledge about their partner's extended family and that whole network there than people who are cohabiting or living common law do. Unfortunately, cohabiting relationships also exhibit higher rates of domestic violence for reasons which are not entirely clear, and this seems to go against the whole gender egalitarianism thing. But that's really an unfortunate thing. And finally, cohabiting relationships in legal terms are different from marriage. I'm making this point because I found that students often have this misconception that being common law is basically the same thing as being married, and it sort of is up until the point when the relationship ends. The laws governing the dissolution of a cohabiting relationship and the laws governing the dissolution of a marriage are actually different, and that's something that's worth knowing about. If you want to know more about that, click on the link below and it will take you to some of the common preconceptions or misconceptions about what cohabitation means, in particular when a relationship ends and things need to be divided up amongst the people involved. The second trend I wanted to focus on is that of same-sex marriage and same-sex partnership in Canada. When I first started teaching this course, which was a while ago, a long time ago, this section of this lecture would be in projecting into the future, what might happen at some point in the future. And it might, at that time I was saying, it might at some point be legal for two people of the same sex to get married. And now fast forward to 2020 and it's become real. It's a huge social change in Canada, a very good one in my view, and it's happened really pretty quickly. A few things to know about the backdrop or the contexts of same-sex partnerships in Canada. The first is that they've always existed. There's always been people who were living together in a committed relationship with a partner of the same sex, even when they couldn't be out about it, even when they couldn't be public about it. So what looks like, when we look at census figures, what looks like an increase in same-sex partnering is really, I think, just a movement from invisible partnerships to visible ones. And if you think back, it might be the case even in your own family that you knew a couple of bachelor uncles, who lived together, or two women friends who were roommates and shared their place and shared their lives. And the word couple might not have been used to describe them, but often these people were known to their friends and families that they were a couple, they were together, they were committed to each other. They just unfortunately could not be as public about it. So what we're seeing, again, not so much an increase in same-sex partnering as a movement from invisible partnerships to ones that are visible and that are publicly acknowledged. Same-sex partnering can take the form of marriage, or it can take the form of cohabitation, just like heterosexual relationships. As we'll see in a bit, the proportions are kind of flipped for same-sex partnerships in that the majority of them are non-marriage, are cohabitation, but the proportion marriage, every time there's a census, it goes up a little bit more. So the proportion in same-sex partnerships is shifting towards more and more being in the form of marriage. We've also seen over the last decade or so within partnerships a big increase in child rearing and parenting together. And I'll have a bit more to say about that later on, as well as in future lectures. So same-sex partnerships in that way are, on a sort of collective level, coming to resemble mixed sex partnerships more, in that a good chunk of them have kids around and are raising children. And finally, the introduction of same-sex marriage, the way was sort of paved for that in Canada, as in other countries, by the existence of domestic partnership legislation. Before same-sex marriage in Canada became legal, many provinces had this kind of odd category of, in Alberta it still is called, interdependent adult partnerships, where two people could declare themselves to be each other's interdependent adult partner. And that was understood to mean they're a couple, they're together, they'll be treated sort of as if they were married, but not quite, not entirely. So many same-sex couples found that a bit demeaning. Like, okay, we're not good enough to get married, but there's this weird little category of interdependent relationship that we can have. No, thank you. Nonetheless, the existence of this kind of patchwork province by province legislation on domestic partnerships paved the way, or opened the door, for same-sex marriage when the time came. Same-sex partnerships or couples are not, the majority of people are not in them. It's a small proportion of the Canadian population, and it's geographically quite concentrated. From census information, the majority of people who identify themselves as being in a same-sex couple are in the major metropolitan settings of Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, or the TMV as it's known. So it's not, same-sex partnerships are not evenly distributed across the country. And as a proportion of census families, the absolute proportion is still pretty small. It's about 1% of all census families are identified as same-sex couples. But the really interesting thing is the rapid growth rate. And this chart here shows you the rate of growth, the increase in same-sex couples and non-same-sex couples within just 10 years. And it's quite amazing. The absolute numbers may be small, but the growth, the increase has really taken off in a remarkable way. So who knows what the 2021 or the 2026 census is going to show about same-sex couples in Canada. Same-sex marriage in Canada, it kind of seems by now like it's been around forever, but in fact it hasn't. It's relatively recent. It was only in 2001, for instance, that the existence of same-sex couples was acknowledged in the national census, which is kind of the picture, the snapshot of how Canadians were living. Prior to 2001, if you had two adults of the same gender co-residing, they were assumed to be just roommates, which again, many same-sex couples found that pretty demeaning. So 2001, the first time that the government actually said, hey, there are people in same-sex committed relationships, and let's let them identify as such on the census. In 2005, just a few years later, Canada became only the third country in the world to recognize and legalize same-sex marriage. Or technically what happened was that marriage law, which requires the parties to be of different genders, was deemed to be unconstitutional and needed to be gotten rid of. So that's actually sort of legally how it happened. So all the laws in various provinces that referred to the husband and the wife, or the man and the woman seeking a marriage license, or what have you, were deemed to be unacceptable in light of the Constitution and had to be rewritten, and we got same-sex marriage. This was the culmination of a lot of legislation and legal arguments and lobbying, which I won't go into in a great deal of detail, except to say that the arguments in favor of same-sex marriage basically took one of two forms. Either they were arguments based on human rights, that the right to marry, the right to have a partner should not be restricted by your gender or by the gender of the other person involved. In other words, just because you're a man, you should not be denied the right to form a marriage with another man. That would be discriminatory on the basis of gender. So it's a human right. And the other kind of prong of these arguments were arguments based on social equality. That with marriage being defined as only for people of different sexes, what that does in effect is create within Canada. There's one class of people who can get married and enjoy all the, advantages or what have you that marriage brings along with it. And there's another class of people who are excluded from all of those things. And that this is a form of social inequality which is not desirable for Canadian society as a whole. Whether you're in a heterosexual marriage or a same-sex partnership or single and unpartnered or what have you, living in an unequal society is not in anybody's best interest. So let's change this element of inequality. Arguments for same-sex marriage also built on the notion that social mores and attitudes and norms change, and the way people viewed the world back in the 1890s or the 1910s or the 1930s is not the way people viewed the world in the 21st century. So we can't sort of stay fixed on points of law that were based in a worldview that has since been outmoded or has since changed. The law needs to catch up with changes in Canadian culture and society. And so as a consequence, June 2005, we got same-sex marriage. A couple of slides earlier, I showed you that even though the total number of same-sex partnerships or marriages is still pretty small in Canada, about 1% of census families, and it's very concentrated geographically in the largest urban areas, nonetheless, the rate of growth is really high, the rate of increase. And this information breaks that down a bit, looking at increases in marriage among same-sex couples. The majority of same-sex couples are not formally married, but the proportions, every census year, the proportions get bigger and bigger. So the trend is definitely following same-sex marriage. This chart here shows you going back to 2001 when 0% of same-sex couples were married because they legally could not do so. And then just moving forward 15 years and since the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2005, and look at the proportions that we've got now in 2016. Or, I mean, now is not 2016, but the most recent census was 2016. LGBTQ activists and community members are not all unanimous about this being the most wonderful thing ever. While I think everybody's kind of agreed on the basic concept that if heterosexual couples are allowed to marry and partake in the benefits and the social status and so forth, then the choice to marry should be available to same-sex couples as well. But some LGBTQ advocates and community members have also flagged the danger in behaving as though what straight people have done for generations, that is to say, get married to each other, is like some sort of ideal or wonderful norm of relationships. And so therefore, getting married is what everybody should aspire to. And they make quite strong and I think quite coherent political and sociological arguments to the effect that marriage as an institution has not always worked out that well for everybody who's in that institution. as we shall see, marriage is also the site of a lot of inequities and other issues. So there's no reason in itself why people in same sex partnerships should be in a huge rush to emulate an institution which has not always worked that well for the heterosexuals. So I just want to signify that while achieving same sex marriage was a major human rights and civil rights victory, there is ambivalence about what it means for same sex couples to get married. And finally, let's bring gender back into the picture and our look at same sex marriages or same sex couples in general. The most obvious thing about them is that you don't have two people of different genders, you have two people of the same gender. So, what difference does gender make when you've got same sex couples or same sex, like two men together as a married or a cohabiting couple? Are they different from two women? Um, Huge topic. Research is ongoing on this, but here's a few interesting things to note. Um, One is that same sex couples break down about 50%, 50%. So in the 2016 census, roughly half of all same sex couples consisted of two men and half of two women, which means that of gay men and gay women, looking at the proportions married, they're about the same as well. So about 1/3 of gay men and 1/3 of lesbians or gay women who are in a couple relationship are married, and the other 2/3 are not married. Where the genders are quite different, though, is when it comes to parenting and child rearing and kind of building the next generation. So, as compared to mixed sex couples, the prevalence of parenting in same sex couples is quite low. Only about 12% of same sex couples are co residing with children under 18, which is much lower than for heterosexuals. So, very few same sex couples are parenting, although some of them are. And of the ones that are actively parenting and are co residing with children, there's a marked gender difference in that the great majority are two women raising children. Why is this the case? Well, probably that there's a couple of reasons. One reason is that women, as we'll see when we talk more about divorce and separation later, when a mixed sex couple splits up, although things are changing, women are still more likely to end up residing with any children that may have been from that couple. So when you have two women coming together and one or both of them may have been in a heterosexual relationship and had kids before, they are likely to bring those children into their same-sex relationship, if you see what I mean. So some of these children were children that the women, the partners in the relationship, brought with them from earlier relationships, and that happens more frequently for women than it does for men. And the other reason is biology. It's simpler, although not easy. Simple and easy are not the same thing. For two women to be able to get pregnant and give birth within their couple relationship and have the child there than it is for two men, because men typically don't, or cisgendered men, I should say, typically don't get pregnant and give birth. So bringing a child, having a child within the relationship is more complicated typically for male couples than it is for female couples. And that's my quick tour of patterns of partnering in Canada, cohabiting, same-sex relationships. Is marriage thriving or dying or living or dead? And on we go to the next week's lectures.